In this video, we take a look at solving equations that have the variable in more than one place. So let's take a look at this particular equation. You'll notice that we have 5x, and later on in the same equation, we're subtracting x. It would help here to think about what we already know. In some earlier lessons, we've talked about our distributive property, and our distributive property led us to talking about like terms and how we gather those like terms together. So when we return to the equation that had x in more than one place, it's the same idea. We look for our like terms, 5x and negative x, gather them together to make 4x. We have some other like terms, the positive 21 and positive 16. We'll gather those together to make positive 37. And now look, we've simplified the equations so that it's much easier to work with. We can solve by subtracting 37 from each side of the equation, and then dividing each side of the equation by 4. Now another time we may see variables in more than one place is when you have the variable on each side of the equals symbol. Again, we're going to think about what we've already seen. When we solved a simpler equation like this, we had 1's on both sides of the equation with negative 15 and positive 10, and we gathered those together by adding or subtracting the same value from each side of the equation. So now let's look at the equation with those c's. Maybe we'll gather our 1's together first by subtracting 10 from each side. Notice you could also decide to add 5 to each side. So long as we do the same thing to each side of the equation, it doesn't matter what we choose to do. Now our equation has 1's only on the left-hand side, so let's use adding or subtracting to gather our c's to be only on the right-hand side. Let's subtract 9c from each side, and now we have a simpler equation that we can finish solving, dividing both sides through by negative 5. Let's take a look at solving this equation in another way. We might have decided to start out subtracting 4c from each side of the equation. That made the equation simpler, and then we could add 5 to each side of the equation and finish solving. It doesn't matter how you decide to approach it, so long as you do the same thing to each side. Our strategy then, when we have variables in more than one place in our equation, is to gather our variables together just like we've been doing with the 1's units, using either addition or subtraction as appropriate. So here's an equation that might make students a little bit more intimidated because of the fractions. But we can add 1/2 to each side, 3 halves adding 1/2 to give us 4 halves. Oh, and 4 halves, that's just a 2. That made the equation simpler. Now let's subtract 3a from each side of the equation and finish solving, dividing both sides by 5. We could write this final answer as a 0.4, but 2/5 is a nice exact value answer, and it will help us this year to work with fractions whenever we possibly can to stay comfortable. So our goal with this lesson is to be able to solve equations that have variables in more than one place. And the reason we do this is so that we can practice solving all sorts of different equations to build our comfort level and be able to use our algebraic skills in future classes.